Everybody, if you could take your seats, we'll get started. Just a couple of quick announcements, kind of logistical. If you could make sure your cell phones are on vibrate so that we don't get any errant rings. There are restrooms in the main hallway, out the back door or the side door if you need to need them for any reason. We have an email link that's txgfuture@thecb.state.tx.us. If folks that are listening or watching online, it would be helpful for us if you could send us an email and let us know that you are online. That way we can get a little better sense of who is participating but may not be here in person. My name is Dan Weaver. I'm an assistant commissioner with the coordinating board. I'm going to make some kind of very general, brief introductions, and then we'll turn it over to the commissioner to make some opening remarks. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I want to introduce to my right is Sandy Baum. Sandy is an economist and a senior fellow at the George Washington Graduate School of Education. Sandy, if you Google Sandy's name, all of the topics that we're here talking about today, Sandy's name is sprinkled about every post that comes up. So we kind of view her, and I've kind of viewed her as kind of being the kind of the voice of reason within financial aid and higher education finance policy. And we're extremely happy that she's here with us today and look forward to hearing her comments. Lee Holcomb is on my far right, who's director of the Higher Education Policy Institute. Lee will be presenting a couple slides, kind of midpoint of the meeting, that I think are very telling and hopefully will generate a fair amount of discussion amongst the participants. I do want to encourage you to participate. This is a discussion and a dialogue on the future of the Texas Grant Program. So this is not it's not geared to be a presentation to be foisted upon you. It's designed for y'all to provide feedback to us as well. And I think that, did everybody get a handout at the front that says Subchapter M towards Texas Excellence Grant Program? After the presentations are over, we're going to kind of get into the kind of the meat and potatoes of our meeting today and go through this 3-page document. And again, have a discussion about some of the main or the key issues that we're going to talk about and how to fill this out essentially to craft a program that's in the best interest of our students within the state. So kind of after the presentation's over, we're going to get into the kind of the meat and potatoes and work through this 3-page document. So with that, does anybody have any specific questions before we get started? Feel free to come up and sit at a microphone. There's a podium here with a microphone, and if you do have questions online, send us an email and we'll try and address those as best we can. So I will turn it over to the Commissioner for opening remarks.
Thank you, Dan. I just wanted to talk about, since this meeting was my idea, I wanted to make sure everybody understands its purpose. This is nothing more than the first of a series of conversations we hope to have around the issue of financial aid, particularly the Texas Grant Program. The context is very simple. As all of you know, we had a cut in the Texas Grant Program in the last legislative session. We expect that the upcoming legislative session will involve some difficult budgetary choices. We further know that if you look at the TEA data, almost 60% of the students that are coming through the pipeline are classified as being poor. I think we have to prepare for the eventuality that we will be short of money to fund a significant number of new students if we don't look at policies and think about making recommended changes. I'm very concerned if we get to the point, and we would have gotten to that point this year if we had allocated Texas Grant monies as usual. I'm very worried about getting to the point where we fund fewer or less than 50% of eligible new students. It seems to me that if we fund less than 50% of eligible new students, we have ceased to offer the Texas Grant Program as a viable promise to students, poor students, to go to college and complete their educations. So we want to consider what the best options going forward are. We haven't made any decisions about what we think the best course of action at the coordinating board should be. We are looking at different models around the country. We are going to ask all of you for ideas about how to proceed, and we will have subsequent conversations. But time has a way of running out on us, and the legislative session is only a few months away. So we wanted to get this conversation started as quickly as possible. I was aware that some people want to take a Good Friday off, but we had other considerations. Once again, getting this conversation going. Secondly, Sandy's availability. I wanted to make sure that she was here for this first discussion about financial aid. But once again, I underscore that there have not been any decisions made. There isn't a clandestine agenda. We want to gather your ideas, and there will be further opportunities for people to participate in this conversation across the state and among all stakeholders. I look forward to thoughtful and a candid conversation about what we ought to think about doing in Texas. I think we've made a lot of assumptions about how financial aid works, and I think we need to look very closely at data to make sure that our recommendations and the actions we take are justified by data. So. Once again, welcome, and particularly those of you who had otherwise planned to take the day off, thank you for coming. One very quick point, we will have lunch available at 12:30 for people that want to stick around and eat here. If you want to grab a sandwich and take it with you while you hit the road, that's fine too. But once again, thank you very much for coming. Well, yes, I've said welcome to all of you, and I should acknowledge that Representative Donna Howard is here. Thank you for coming.
So we're going to turn the mic over to Sandy for a few minutes, and she's going to instill some wisdom amongst the group.
Thank you. I will do my best. Let me just say first that you all know a lot more about Texas than I do, and my hope is that I can help to provide some broader national perspective for your conversations and think with you about some of the basic principles that I hope will be underlying your discussions about the future of your grant program. I think it's really exciting that you're having this conversation. I think that so frequently the only conversation people can have is there enough money? The answer to that is clear. No, there's not enough money. We just need more money. And while probably we need more money, that's not really going to solve the problems. And being able to say, how can we use the dollars that we have most effectively is just critically important. And it doesn't mean that you're accepting the dollar amount. It means that whatever amount of dollars you have, you want to use them as effectively as possible. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of things that I'm involved in that I think are ongoing, that people are thinking about, that I think might be helpful as background. And one is that I'm involved in a project at the Brookings Institution that brought together a group of people from around the country to really think about, is there any advice that we could give to states in thinking about how to improve state grant programs? And of course, there are 50 different states with different grant programs, and there's not one specific blueprint, but there are a couple of ideas, and we're going to come out with a report which we hope people will pay a little bit of attention to. Not earth-shattering, not things you haven't thought of, but I think important in terms of basic principles. And one of those principles is just really thinking about, excuse me, how you target your grant aid which students are getting it and how much difference it makes. I mean, the point here is that you're trying to change the behavior of students, right? You're not just trying to make life easier for people, you're trying to improve educational attainment. And there's so much evidence that it's students with the most limited resources who are the most price sensitive and who are most likely to be unable to enroll in and complete education if they don't have the money. So it's easy. I mean, you know, you're not Georgia, which is a good thing, where they give more money to rich kids than they do to poor kids, and because, you know, it's all based on high school grades. So the extremes of what goes on in the country are great, but it is always important, no matter how much you're giving your money only to Pell Grant recipients or whatever, to think about what is the impact on those students. Are there students at different institutions? Are there students who are first-year students or continuing students? Are there students with different levels of need whose behavior will be more affected and who will therefore give you more bang for the buck of your money? And another issue is just the simplicity and transparency of the programs. So lots of states have a million different programs. So if you have a program for public institutions and a program for private institutions, that's justifiable. But you need to think about, you know, if you start breaking things down, is that a problem? And one of the things that we've thought about in terms of this idea of separate goals, separate programs, is all of us have in our heads the idea that there's need-based aid and there's merit-based aid. And I think that might not be such a constructive dichotomy. And that has to do with, I mean, if we believe in need-based aid, which the targeting proposal says that we should, then there's sometimes hesitation to include any academic criteria at all in the programs, because students who are most at risk are most likely and neediest, most likely to have difficulty meeting those criteria. But it's one thing to exclude students because they didn't get a B average in high school. It's another thing to think about what do we expect of students once they're in college, and to think about academic progression. And we know that students respond to incentives and also that institutions respond to incentives. So thinking, you know, students need to complete a certain number of credit hours in order to maintain their grant aid is not something that punishes students because they have to work. It's something that says, you have to have this priority, and if we give you more money, you know, we will give you more money if you take more credit hours, and students do seem to respond to that sort of thing. So in terms of, you know, how many students are graduating in 4 years, how many students are graduating altogether, thinking about that and putting some sort of academic criteria like that in terms of progress into programs is a really reasonable thing to do in terms of accomplishing your goals. I have to say that nobody can come up with simple rules, but this group of people that I brought together immediately came up with 2 things that everybody agreed on, just straightforward. We can't believe that so many grant programs have this. One is first come, first serve. Underfunded programs, how do we decide who gets the money? Just whoever gets the money. It may be whoever gets there first without telling people when they have to get there. It may be, if you have a decentralized program, something that you're not exactly sure how you're deciding who gets the money. But really thinking about, if you don't have enough money to go around, what's a rational way to allocate the funds instead of just arbitrarily. That's one. And the other issue is cliff effects. So if you think, you know, either you get, if you're lucky, you get $7,000, and if you're not lucky, you get 0. Or if you have $1 extra of need, you get, you know, $7,000, and if you have $1 less of need, you get 0. Those sorts of cliffs, where if you're on one side or the other of the line, are really problematic. So that's lots of ways to design programs in those boundaries. So this. That's sort of the conversation that we've been having, and it seems to me that the questions that you're asking are the questions that we've been asking, and I think that's terrific. Who's going to be helped? How can you use your marginal dollars most effectively to get the most of what it is? I mean, what are the purposes of your state grant program? Which, amazingly, many states don't know what the purpose of their state grant program is, or they haven't articulated that. And if you articulate the purpose, then you can ask how to use dollars most effectively to accomplish that purpose. And that means if you're going to have dollars that are cut, where can you cut without losing more than you have to? And if you have extra dollars, how can you use those dollars to get the most of what you want? Now, It would be great if on the national scene we were having conversations like that. I think you're all, I'm sure, tuned into the Pell Grant conversations and people's concerns about whether Pell Grants will be significantly cut or will they, or is the current program viable? And it's obviously terrifically important because it's the base of funding on which, all of your grant recipients rely. And I have to say that I'm reasonably optimistic. I mean, it's not like the Pell Grant program is going to get cut in half tomorrow. Some of these dramatic Republican budgets are not going to happen. But I do think that we're having difficulty getting a rational national conversation about this because funding for the Pell Grant program has doubled just in the past couple of years. I mean, it's amazing that we now spend $36 billion, and 3 years ago we were spending $18 billion. And we have a third of all students, undergraduate students, getting Pell Grants. So. And then whenever any little thing is cut, people are, oh my God, you're cutting Pell Grants. Pell Grants are great. Pell Grants are great. But you can't double the program in 2 years and then say if we pull back a little bit, the world is going to come to an end, because that's not reasonable and because nobody realized what was going to happen. It's predictable when you look at some of the changes that were made. And I will just tell you one issue that's on the table, which is I, along with some other people, proposed, to be a full-time student, you need 12 credit hours to be a full-time student for Pell. And then we want to know why people don't graduate in 4 years. Well, they take 12 credit hours, and they do take 12 credit hours, and then they don't graduate in 4 years. So, and if you take 9, you get less money. But if you take 15, you don't get more money. And it seems to me that if you take 15, you should get more money than if you take 12. If you say it that way, you don't get a lot of opposition. But if you say if you take 12, you should get less money than if you take 15, people are outraged. And a lot of people are really outraged that I've said this. But this is an example of thinking about something where if you can provide a positive incentive for students to behave in ways that will help them meet their goals, that can be really helpful. It could also save money. So asking questions like that, I think, in terms of Pell and in terms of your state grant programs, is terrifically constructive. Not to be afraid to say, who will lose money if we make this change, but to say, how effective will the program be? And you do want to know who will win and who will lose, but you want to know how people's behaviors and educational attainment will change as a result of losing or gaining those dollars. So I'll be happy to engage in this conversation in whatever way I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Do you want to make any comment before I? So just to kind of allude back to some of the points that the commissioner made, I'm going to do a really brief kind of snapshot of Texas Grant pre-2012 and kind of what our current strategies are to manage the program in the current fiscal year and next fiscal year. And then really the bulk of what we want to spend the most of our time is looking at, what do we need to look at going forward with Texas Grant. So just a real brief snapshot of Texas Grant. Up prior to 2012 and like maybe 2004 was really the last year that it was quote unquote fully funded. So for the last 9 years, essentially, the program has been insufficiently funded to meet all of the eligible students. So we got into a mode of the structure of the statute was such that there was a commitment made to renewal students. So as we had more renewal students, they took more of the dollars. And as they took more of the dollars, there was less money available for incoming freshmen. And that was essentially the accepted practice of the program. Nobody really particularly liked it. However, it was what it was. So heading into this this current fiscal year, the commissioner and in consultation with others was, how do we stretch, we got a budget reduction, we need to stretch our dollars, how can we do that within the confines of the statute as it currently exists? And this year's current maximum award is $7,100 and for a university student and $2,100 for a community college student. Yes? So essentially the instructions were within the confines of the program. In order to maintain the pipeline that the commissioner mentioned before, we need to ratchet down essentially the maximum dollar amounts that are available. Most folks, and I guess from a reporting standpoint, it seems like it's worked very, very effectively as far as keeping the pipeline open. But it is taking money away from renewal students so that we can fund incoming students. So that's been the practice this year, and I think we're to the tune of, and I wrote this down so I would have it, And then I didn't write that one down. We have 20,000+ new university students this year and about 15,000 new community college students this year as a result of this particular practice. It's not ideal, but it served its purpose. So we're going about the same practice for 2013. I think allocations went out a couple of weeks ago with similar types of instructions based on a $7,400 maximum award for university students, still trying to target a lower average award amount on each particular campus in order to spread the money out, trying to hit this 50% target that the commissioner set. So that's kind of where we've come from. This very I don't want to say clunky, because clunky is such a, with all these academics up here with PhDs, I've never heard anybody say clunky. But Texas Grant is kind of a clunky program because it's got big, huge awards for a very small number of people. So when you start to try to management and work off of some of the comments that Sandy mentioned about targeting specific aid to specific students, it doesn't work so well when you have such big dollar amounts and that you can't carve up into maybe smaller bite-sized pieces. So I think in part of what we're seeing currently going on is that we could probably carve it up into maybe some smaller bite-sized pieces and still have the same effectiveness that it currently has, and maybe be more effective in the fact that we're reaching more students. So the going forward, looking at Texas Grant, we've, within the Financial Aid Advisory Committee, I think some of these topics we're going to cover today will seem like we've been covering them for years, because it's a common, how should we prioritize renewal students, and how should we prioritize new students, and what is, should we include Pell as part of the award criteria or the need criteria? So many of these topics will be kind of painfully going over and over again, but I think this is hopefully today going to inform some real tangible changes to Texas Grant that might come about in the next, hopefully potentially in the next session. But ultimately, we're looking very long-term into the future of what Texas Grant needs to look like and how it needs to work and what the effectivity of the Texas Grant program is. I'm not going to spend a terribly long time. Dr. Holcomb has some powerful slides that I think would be beneficial to go through now, and then we'll follow back up. And really, again, I want to have a dialogue with the folks that are here today. We have many microphones available if you want to start. This isn't church yet on Sunday, so if you want to migrate up to the front of the church, you're more than welcome to do that. And then I'll turn it over to Lee.
We also have some additional sets.
Can everybody hear me? Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. As we mentioned, Rider 60 is probably very familiar to everybody in this room. What we've done is an extension of that analysis, just to sort of briefly bring everybody up to speed, remind people of Rider 60. Rider 60 was an analysis that the agency developed some very robust database for the LBB to conduct some analysis on. And the focus of that analysis was looking at the relationship between academic preparation in high school and how that predicts graduation once students enroll. There was a tremendous amount of energy invested in development of this database, and so we thought that it would be a shame to stop mining that resource with the end of the Rider 60 report. So we've taken that same database and we've done some extended analysis. The focus of this analysis is looking more specifically at what's going on at the university level and looking at a more nuanced perspective of what's happening as students progress through the higher education pipeline. And one thing I should want to mention is that George Purcell of the LBB did the Rider 60 analysis. He also provided analytical support for us as we were progressing through this analysis as well. George is in the audience. Very briefly, moving forward, introduction, the first two bullets here are the main research questions which drive this analysis. Both of these research questions are motivated by the desire, as Dan mentioned, to figure out if there's a way in which we can more effectively allocate financial aid dollars to increase persistence. And so the first question is, what is the relationship between grant aid and persistence? And then how does this relationship differ as students go through the pipeline? So we're looking at this relationship and trying to determine whether or not there's anything that we can look at in this relationship and that might inform a more efficient allocation, a more productive allocation of financial aid dollars. The sample is 15,614 first-time fall 1994 four-year enrollees.
2004, right?
I'm sorry, 2004 enrollees with at least 12 semester credit hours and who were Pell eligible. Okay. Of course, as I mentioned, this is matched to K-12 data, so we have very extensive information regarding the academic preparation of these students as measured by their K-12 course taking and performance. And of course, we're looking at persistence and graduation for 6 years. So we took this cohort, 2004, fall 2004, and we moved them forward for 6 years. So, likelihood of full-time persistence into second year. So we're taking a look at all the enrolled students in their freshman year, and we're looking at their likelihood of persistence in the second year as a function of the percent of cost of attendance covered by grants during their freshman year. So we're taking a look at their freshman grant aid and asking whether or not there's a relationship between that grant aid and subsequent enrollment in the second year. Okay? And so you'll notice I'm considering what I call the average first-time, full-time student, and I often find it helpful to sort of provide some concrete terminology to this, so I'm calling her Stella. This is Stella, the average student. Stella is Hispanic and a female, is enrolled full-time during her freshman year. And so what we have here is actual persistence rates for Stella. And you'll see is at 0% of grant funding, Stella has an estimated likelihood of persistence to her second year about 48 and 49%. Now, if you go all the way up, give her a grant aid 100% of cost of attendance, her likelihood of persistence into the second year goes up to 75%. Okay? And so what we see here is that generally speaking, more grant aid is better. Okay? But what's interesting about this trajectory of the rise and the likelihood to persist is that it's different. It's steeper here and then flattens. And that's where we can draw some implications or think about some implications for how to effectively allocate financial aid. And to illustrate that, what I want to do is ask you to consider, let's consider Stella, assume that Stella was at 10% of her cost of attendance, grant aid. And it turns out that if you allocate an additional $1,425 to her financial aid package, you move her to 20%. Okay? Because the cost of attendance for this institution, which she's attending, is about $14,250. Okay? So, as you can see here, her likelihood to persist into the second year increases from 55% to 60%. It's actually 5 percentage points, which translates into $285 per percentage increase in likelihood to persist. Okay, so it's sort of a productivity measure, an efficiency measure of your financial aid dollar. So that's for Stella at 10%, right? Let's consider a student I'm calling Alyssa, who has the same profile as Stella, same average student profile. Okay. But instead of her being at 10% and trying to move her at 20%, what we're going to do is give her, she's at 50%, and we're going to give her the same $1,425 to move her to 60% of cost of attendance. And what you see here is that you increase her likelihood of persisting to the second year. It's actually 2 percentage points, from 70% to 72%. Okay? Which translates into a much higher cost, more than double the cost, $713 per percentage increase. Okay? So the financial aid, the return on investment, so to speak, on your financial aid dollar of Alyssa at 50% of cost of attendance is much lower than the return on investment of your financial aid dollar of Stella at 10%, moving her from 10% to 20%. Okay? All right. So what we establish here is that for students going from the freshman year to the second year, if you have $1,425 and you're interested in maximizing the likelihood of persistence, or you're interested in increasing the likelihood of persistence, it makes more sense to pay attention to students who are at this end of the distribution in terms of their percent of grants, cost of attendance covered by grants. Okay? All right. Now, we're also looking at, we're also looking at the relationship between grant aid awarded and subsequent persistence as students progress through the pipeline. So what we have here in red is actually the same information I had in the prior slide. This is the likelihood of persistence of students in their freshman year to persist to the second year. Okay? So this is full-time persistence into the second year. Okay, this is Stella, right? Okay, now let's imagine Stella enrolling in the second year. Right, so we've got all these students enrolled in the second year, and we're going to do an analysis of the relationship between grant aid in the second year and likelihood to persist into the third year. It's the same thing, but just moving 1 year later. Okay? And what we see is that this is the estimated likelihood of persistence for Stella. Okay? Same student with the same profile. And what we see here is that the likelihood of persistence from second to third year, Stella is much more likely to persist than she was from first year to second year, right? Which I think is consistent with what we all expect. Okay? What you see here is that you've got sort of the same trend. You've got the slope here of your trend is steeper, it flattens out. But it's not quite as steep here. So what implications does that have for how productive your financial aid dollar is? Well, let's take a look at that. So let's review. From the previous slide, if we're going to move Stella from 10% to 20% with an investment of $1,425, remember that resulted in an effective $285 per percentage increase in your likelihood to persist. Okay? If you make the same investment in Stella when she's a second year, persisting to third year, your productivity of your financial aid dollar goes down. Your cost of your percentage increase goes up from $285 per percentage increase to $356. Okay? So likewise, what you have here is that your financial aid, this flattens here. So if you're going to award additional financial aid dollars from a student going from here to here, you have basically no increase in likelihood of persistence into the third year. Okay? So that's looking at first year to second year versus second year to third year. And now I'm going to go on and talk about the persistence from students who are enrolled in third year to fourth year. Okay? As you see, the likelihood, once a student gets to third year, they're very likely to persist to the fourth year. And the probability of the persistence to the fourth year in full-time persistence doesn't really depend too much upon the level of grant aid. Okay? So, I can invest an additional $1,425 in this student here and maybe increase the likelihood of that student persisting just 1 percentage point. Right? So what I hope this slide communicates is if we've got 1,400, if I'm a financial aid officer and I've got $1,425 I'm thinking about awarding to a student, if I'm interested in maximizing, or not maximizing, in increasing the likelihood of persistence of the student, the first place I'm going to look is freshmen who are on at this end of the cost of attendance percent grant distribution. And then I would look at Sophomores, I don't think I would look towards juniors. That's what this data suggests. Okay? So what I hope we've clarified here is, with this type of analysis, I want to emphasize a couple of things. I think what this illustrates is the potential power of this kinds of analysis to really inform the discussion about how best to distribute financial aid dollars. And I want to stress that as far as we're concerned, this is sort of the first pass of this data, looking at these questions. Like any robust and sophisticated analysis, we came across an additional 2 or 3 research questions every day that would be really interesting to pursue. And I would really like to invite folks in providing some input on how we might advance this analysis. This analysis, I hope, will inform the rest of the discussion today, and I hope the discussion on how best to allocate financial aid moving forward. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Lee. I think it might be a good time to solicit some feedback from the audience before we start venturing into the more mundane task of slogging through some of the details. The last slide that Lee put up as a person that really, if you try to divorce yourself from the kind of previous Texas grant practices, this is essentially 180 degrees opposite of what the current Texas grant policies mandate, which is funding renewal students at maximum awards and giving leftover money to freshmen. This data suggests that that's not what we should be doing from a state's perspective. We should be investing our resources in freshmen and perhaps less so in upper division. So when we start wrestling with statutory language and looking at program structure, it kind of takes us a step backwards, and kind of an admonition the commissioners made is don't get bogged down in previous practice. We're trying to look at what we should be doing in the future, not putting Band-Aids and patches on kind of what we've been what the program used to be. So the last slide was particularly interesting as an understatement, and I think it really does try to help to inform our conversation today and put this into the context of looking at this in a long-range manner and not looking at what can we do short-term. Make a comment.
These are preliminary data, and we welcome responses regarding the conclusions that Lee has reached. We want, if you want to do data analyses of your own particular campuses, we welcome that as well. Any questions you have, if as we do further analysis and that further analysis confirms what Lee has just presented, then that has some very profound ramifications for the way we do financial aid in Texas. But this is precisely what this meeting was intended to do, to open up the conversation about the conventional practices we have in Texas and some of the assumptions we've made about how to distribute the precious financial aid that we have in Texas. This suggests we've been doing it wrong. And if we have been, then we're going to, I think we should all work together to make sure that we get it straight. Lee, I have 2 questions. First of all, to what extent did you consider academic preparation in determining persistence from the first year of college to the second year of college? And secondly, very quickly, what would a financial aid program look like based on what you've just presented?
Well, we control for academic achievement while in college by controlling for GPA. So, and then of course we maintain the controls for academic achievement while in high school. So you got controls for academic achievement while in high school, and then GPA. The other main control that we have in the model is the number of semester credit hours taken. Okay, so we can talk more about that. And so, each one of those ways we're controlling this is sort of a conversation unto itself, which is sort of very researchy. But I think those are the kinds of issues that I would really like to invite further conversations about subsequent to this meeting. But I think, the results are the last slide, as Dan mentioned and as you mentioned, is that, it comes down to if you're interested in actually maximizing the impact and changing behavior, as Sandy mentioned, if that's what we're really talking about is changing behavior, then I think the results are consistent with the focus on freshmen.
Well, it's not necessarily changing behavior, it's incentivizing good behavior and good performance. Mm-hmm. Because Sandy not only talked about changing behavior, you talked about incentivizing behavior, correct?
Well, yeah.
And clearly, the results suggest that the second-year students are not quite as responsive as freshmen are to additional grant aid, but they are responsive, and so those are the two populations I think that should be the priority. I think of the financial aid policy. The subsequent, once students get to be in the third year, the data just don't suggest that they're very sensitive to the amount of grant aid that they're receiving. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think your data and your sort of takeaways from this are very interesting, and while I don't necessarily disagree with them, I was wondering if you might have an opportunity to look at two or three things before we move forward with something like this. And one is, the data you've got is for a cohort that's 18 years old, and the
well,
student
it's 2004, not 1994. I'm sorry, that was a mistake.
I'm sorry, it's
2004. Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We looked at these slides multiple times, and I can't believe we didn't catch that. So,
yeah, I mean, double checking things.
Mm-hmm.
That happens. But even with a 2004 cohort, that's 8 years old, and we've,
Mm-hmm.
We know there's rapidly shifting demographics in the state, and I wonder if at least to look at the likelihood of the first to second year persistence, if you might be able to rerun these data with a more recent cohort.
I think that's a great idea, and actually, I think that the analysis can serve to help formulate policy leading into the legislative session. Certainly, that's the main tempo driver for what's going on right now. But I think also looking beyond the immediate legislative session, I think one of the things that we might like to try to do is to develop these tools, sort of analytical tools that we can use to readily and quickly look at how these relationships might be changing over time.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that this is something. This is a good example of one of those ideas that we had, as we were furthering this analysis, that is on the list. It's on the list of things to do, and I mean you could very easily do that. We don't have to wait 8 years. We don't have to wait 6 years to do that. And I think that's especially critical because freshmen are our main priority.
Right.
Right.
Right. The other thing I was thinking about is knowing how things, once they get into the sort of the policy debate, tend to spin and evolve. I wonder if there might be some value in sort of inverting this and looking at what happens to year-to-year persistence if the amount of grant aid diminishes a little bit from year to year. I mean, it's sort of implied in this, but if we could, if you could actually find some data that would show that, because it could well be that we could end up with folks saying, well, let's, sort of front load larger grants and then diminish them as time goes on, and maybe that's a sound strategy, maybe it's not, but I think we need to be. It's almost like that needs to be tested in and of itself. Rather than just sort of try to adapt these data to thinking about that. Just a thought.
Well, I think one of the reasons why I would really invite these kinds of comments is, I think what we need to do is try to make this analysis as germane to the decisions that financial aid officers have to make on a day in and day out basis. So, I think that once we do that, we can get it to the point where we can identify the relationships that are going to naturally boil up to policy implications much more readily. So, these are the kind of examples of extensions of the analysis that I think we should definitely pursue.
I also have one other question, and it's really just a technical question. You make reference to looking at grant aid. Would that be any sort of gift aid that the student receive, including private outside scholarships, institutional scholarships, things like that?
Yes. So it's basically free money.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's how we define grant aid.
Thank you.
Working?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question.
Could you identify yourself before you start? I'm sorry. Could you identify yourself before you?
Elaine, University of Texas American. I have a question, and then perhaps income levels of families. I was wondering if there was any segmentation of the data by family income level, and wondering if we wouldn't see differentiation in results if we look, let's say, at somebody, with in the lowest quartile, for example, or a very low family income versus someone that has a higher family income as far as persistence and how grants affect it.
The answer to your question is that that's actually a very good comment. That's very consistent with some comments that Sandy gave us. We control for EFC. We don't control for income, but we control for EFC in the model. Oh, we do control for both. We've got control for income and EFC in the model. So what you see here are the average effects for students of all income levels, or EFC levels, okay? It's a very different question to ask whether or not the relationship between grant aid and persistence differs by different income levels. And that is yet another good example for extending the analysis. So, that question could be very easily answered, in fact, with our data.
And I assume from your response that we propose to do that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, I think that there's, in terms of, we've got to prioritize things. We've got a certain amount of time between now and the beginning of the session, beginning of hearings. And so what I would really like to do is try to come up with a process by which maybe we can prioritize what we really need to look at and what's going to move the ball further that's inform policy within the time frames. So I think that's one of the things that I internally need to work on.
I have a question. There's a difference between the level of grant aid and the change in the level of grant aid. So, this is very compelling evidence, but you could worry that some people might say, why do we have to give grant aid at all to continuing students? And that this finding doesn't suggest that. And of course, what you would want to know partly, and I don't know if you can do this with your data, but you really want to know if somebody comes in as a first-year student and gets, a $6,000 grant, and then suddenly their grant is cut, will they respond differently than if they had that lower grant, all along? And part of this is how much variation there is in the data and how people have been treated before. But I just think in terms of thinking about the next step of what is the policy implication, I think the policy implication clearly, if all this stands up, is you do need to focus more on incoming students. And that's consistent with all of the evidence that we have. I just saw a study of what happens when institutions lose their eligibility for Title IV aid because of loan defaults or whatever, and it was that their enrollments drop, but students don't drop out; they stay there even though their school is no longer has been sanctioned in this way. But that doesn't mean that we can suddenly say all the grants go to first and second year students.
I think that's consistent with Tom. Tom, isn't that consistent with your remark and taking a look at what happens when you decrease grants as students progress through the pipeline?
Yeah, I think that's essentially what I was trying to suggest.
Okay.
it would also seem to me, in looking at the data, Joe Pettibon, Texas A&M, it would also seem to me, looking at the data, that academic preparation has a huge impact on who's getting how much money, since you're counting everything. So these are all Pell Grant recipients at four-year institutions, but the amount of scholarship dollars that they might be receiving that are filling that void in some respects, to where they're getting to 100% cost of attendance coverage or 80% cost of attendance coverage, is in part due to a difference in academic preparation. And so you could almost expect persistence to be lower if there's weaker academic preparation. And then I also look at it and go, looking at how much money is being given in each one of those groups. So some are getting 10% of their cost of attendance coverage, some 20%. How much of that is impacted by the existing rules that are in place that prevent us from giving money to some of those students at the lower end?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have any specific comments about Lee's slides?
Actually,
or any comments that have been made to this point?
Lisa Blazer, UTSA. The only question I have, and we still have issues with juniors dropping out before they finish their senior year. So that I do think we have to be cautious about lowering anything, front-loading grants for freshmen. That's not, I don't think that's a good practice. But also, we have a lot of transfer students. So have we given any consideration to incoming transfer students and potentially, I think that's something we should explore with the Texas grant, because if we have a lot of transfer students coming in, we want to set them up for success as well. So they're incoming students too. And so that would be your juniors and seniors. So I'm assuming this data doesn't take transfer students into consideration.
No, it does not. Yeah.
So I think that's something we should explore. If we're really looking at the Texas grant policy and how we're changing, transfer students should be taken into consideration. If they didn't receive it at the community college level, how are we going to set them up for success as well? So I think we should explore that too.
That's one of the issues we have to take a look at, because as we see a greater and greater movement of students out of high school into community colleges, we have to make certain that we make it easier for students to receive financial aid when they transfer from a community college to a university. And because the numbers of community college students who receive Texas grants is relatively low, under current practice, they're simply ineligible for Texas grants once they transfer. So that's precisely one of the issues we still have to take a look at.
And can I also make a follow-up comment to Lisa's earlier point? One of the things you have to keep in mind is there's statewide. This is a result of statewide analysis. So the effects that we see here are statewide results. And while we've never done this analysis, it makes a contribution for that reason. But what we don't do is look at how these results differ by particular institutions. So, and I think when it comes down to the goal of trying to come up with a tool that's useful in formulating policy, I think we also need to take that into account as well. And types of institutions. So how does these relationships differ by research institutions, emerging, et cetera?
And I guess, Lisa, I'll make just a quick comment of, I think, the 2+2 strategies that have been frequently debated at the Capitol. This is kind of another one of those points where the current Texas grant program is not very conducive to transfer students, and we fully appreciate that. And it's one of the strategies and one of the implications of all of the other work that we're doing is to try to identify. We need to identify funds that need to be set aside to be available for transfer students. We need to encourage students to transfer and enroll in a four-year institution. But if the structure of the current program doesn't facilitate that, then we kind of beat our heads against the wall. And
yeah, and I think we just need to, I know right now if they get an associate's degree, unfortunately students don't always go into a community college saying, I'm going to get an associate's degree. They go in saying, I'm going to get my core out of the way, save some money, and then transfer. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the policy for incoming Texas grant students.
We are looking at those issues as well.
Lee, you just alluded to something that I think might also be something that you would want to include. You were talking about looking at different institutions by institutional mission, but it might be a good thing to look in terms of institutional selectivity and whether that curve becomes different depending on the selectivity of the institution that the student's attending.
Yes, Tom?
I'm Tom Malecki, UT Austin.
Forgive you for that, but you can go.
Actually, the mention of mission, and Dan, I was thinking about this in your comments when you talked about 2004 being the last year the Texas Grant Program was sort of fully funded. In the conversations you folks have had with folks at the Capitol, in your own view, is there a way to define a mission for the Texas Grant Program today? Is it still what it originally was? I think it seems to me, and my understanding of the original mission is somewhat limited because I wasn't here in the state at that point, but it seems to me that perhaps it's evolved or changed. And I wonder if there's a way to reaffirm and establish what sort of the purpose, the primary purpose of the program is today, because it's a program that's several years old, and as programs evolve, as the environment evolves, sometimes the mission changes.
It's a great point. So what is the goal? Maybe that should be our opening part of our discussion for the rest of the morning. What should Texas Grant be?
Well, let me respond to that. I don't think the goal of Texas Grant has changed. The goal, as I understand it, I wasn't here either, but is to enable more poor students to attend a college and university without fear that they will either not be able to attend or not be able to persist because of lack of financial resources. I think that's still the fundamental purpose of the program. What has changed is that the program hasn't grown at a rate that's commensurate with the program hasn't grown in resources at a rate that's commensurate with the growth of the student population particularly of those students with need. And what we're trying to do, and this is another iteration of that process, is we're trying to make the most effective use of the dollars that we have. We know that we don't have enough dollars. Once again, as Dan pointed out, the last time the program was fully funded was 2004. We've had some members of the legislature who've said your number one priority should be to ask for more money for Texas Grant. That's been precisely our number one priority. But for the first time, we had a cut in funding for Texas Grant this last legislative session, and I think once that precedent has been established, that it's incumbent on us to recognize that might be the continuing circumstance into the future. So we have to think about making adjustments, and that's the purpose of this opening conversation around the issue of the Texas Grant Program. Linda?
I just wanted to add to your comments. You're exactly right about the purpose of the program. I worked for a member of the legislature. When the program was created, I worked for Irma Rangel, who was the chair of the House Higher Education Committee at the time, and she, I believe, co-sponsored House Bill 713, which created the Texas Grant Program, and it was Henry Cuellar and Senator Ellis who authored the bills. And the original purpose was really to target and encourage students to be academically prepared and also have financial need, which is why the recommended high school program was one of the criteria. And I think today that's still the case, especially with the changes that were made in Senate Bill 28, was to encourage students to be academically prepared, but also to have financial need. So just wanted to add that and remind everybody that that was the original intent.
And I guess to kind of follow that on, it's, there's a lot of language in the statute encouraging students to graduate from high school and matriculate to higher education. So the beginning of the program kind of assumes that there will always be funding there. And as the program grew and the funding started being parsed out to renewal students, then that kind of promise to high school graduates started to go by the wayside. I know, Jane, at the beginning of the program, we sent out flyers and we had billboards, and it was, to get a Texas grant as a high school graduate. And that quickly came to a halt simply because there were no funds for those students anymore. I'm not putting you on the spot, Jane, but I'd like to kind of transition and start working through a little bit of, this is not going to be very exciting for many people that are here, but I think this is probably the most critical piece that we're hoping to accomplish in the next hour, is to kind of talk through some of these blanks that are listed on this particular worksheet. I will be happy to work through them by each particular topic, and if somebody has questions or comments or wants to shout from the back of what they think the number ought to be or what we think we need to focus on or perhaps not focus on within each part of these particular sections, please stop me. And if not, we're going to just kind of plow through this, and I know we have microphones out there if you want to jump in.
If you have a question, if you hear something that Dan says that you want to ask a question about, why don't you simply just walk forward to this table and sit at one of the microphones and ask your question. That might be the simplest way.
Of course, we may not get past the first question, which is always hotly debated as far as the current statute requires at least 3/4 of a full course load to be eligible to receive a Texas grant. There's been discussion for many years about making that full-time. I think the financial aid community embraces the notion of making it full-time. However, it's difficult to define what full-time means. Full-time in a context of an academic year is 30 semester credit hours. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take 15 semester credit hours each in a 2-semester period. It means you have to take 30 semester credit hours in a 12-month period. And the federal requirements are 12 hours is considered to be full-time, kind of back to the comment that Sandy made originally. So I think we kind of have concurrence that full-time makes sense for Texas grant eligibility. This particular question is how do we define what full-time is relative to being a Texas grant recipient? And then I'm going to throw that out there because I know everybody's got an opinion about that.
If we want to be consistent with what is happening at the federal level, and we talk about simplicity, 12 hours, there is no question about what is full-time. It is 12 hours. So that's not for undergraduate students. So if we're talking about just being enrolled full-time, if that's what we want the criteria to be, keep it simple. That would be in line with what Pell Grant is and every other form of financial aid that we give out. So
there are questions being raised in Washington about that. And my own view is I don't think it's terribly confusing to students to say that, well, there's a federal standard, there's a state standard. Once again, the question to me is not a matter of simplicity. The question is what is the best way to use our financial aid dollars in Texas.
I thought,
I'm sorry.
I think simplicity and simplicity is desirable. My question to the group is, in this case, is simplicity more important than stretching our limited financial aid dollars further? You have two competing priorities. That's one of the reasons we want to have this conversation.
Elaine Rivera, UT Pan American. I think also something to consider was something that Sandy mentioned, and that would be that while full-time is 12 hours, perhaps the consideration of a higher grant amount for a student that enrolls for 15 hours as opposed to enrolling for 12 hours.
Well, the counter issue is then you're giving we have to balance what the emphasis what that emphasis would do in terms of being able to fund a larger number of students as against encouraging students to finish more quickly. It's a legitimate question. We'll take a look at it.
And you could take into account your funding available and then sort of set the stages based on that so that you're trying to reach a certain percentage of your population.
Since my name came up many times in this little exchange, it is clear that there are competing priorities and that simplicity is a priority, but that also, I mean, that there are ways in which complicating things a little bit in comprehensible ways that don't actually complicate them terrifically for students really helps in terms of targeting, because you could just give everybody the same amount of money and that's simple but not very effective. You know, the thing is that, I mean, the conversation about what would be best would be that you could give more money to students with more credit hours and less to students with fewer credit hours. I mean, I'm sure there are students taking 9 credit hours who really need the money and they're working and therefore they can't go for more hours. And in the perfect world, you would be able to give them some help. But what you're talking about is we don't have enough money to do that, and right now we're randomly excluding people, so should we exclude people for this reason instead of excluding them randomly? So I think that makes the conversation more difficult, because it's not that people wish not to fund those students. And then I don't know enough about the detail of how this works here, but to me, like when I think about Pell Grants, I think, wouldn't it be great if you could go 12-12-6? Now there's no summer Pell, but why? But now if you go 12-12, you're done. You've used your full-time grant, and you can't go over the summer. And what you care about is that students have enough credits in the course of the year to progress, however those are allocated. So if there's a way to make that possible without being too complicated, you know, that would seem to make sense. But again, you just really do have the problem of, are you going to fund people? And here you're saying you're only going to fund people for 4 years, but a lot of people are going to take 12 credits a semester for 4 years, and then you're not going to fund them anymore. And so I think you have to keep that in consideration.
So I'm on with the University of North Texas. I think something to also consider is the affordability of college. And if we require students to enroll more hours, but then our institutions are seeing lesser institutional grant money, the federal government, you know, Pell hasn't increased in the last 2 years. How can students afford college?
I do think it's an interesting, and to Sandy's point, I think the better way to look at this is the progress towards degree, and not something that's measured 4 years out. 4 years out doesn't help the student understand that if I take 12, 12, 12, 12, 12, I don't get to 120 hours in 4 years. You know, but doing it 15 hours for a semester is very different than doing you must be on track to graduate within 4 years. And that means, you know, you've completed at least 30 hours after 1 year. You've completed at least 60 hours after 2 years. That's different than 15 a semester. There are lots of things that need to be looked at in that context, because a student could take 12, 12, and 6 and go in the summer. They could take 15 and 15. They could take 13 and 17 to get to the 30 hours. And I don't think we want to penalize the student who takes 13 and 17. So, I mean, I think you got to look at that in a variety of different ways. To me, the better measure is ultimately looking at what is it that the student needs to do to progress towards degree, and where are they at after year 1, after year 2, after year 3 for renewal of the grant. Keep in mind, many of these students come in with dual credit, so they already got a head start, and in some cases don't need to take, and maybe they should, but don't need to take 15 hours in their first semester in order to maintain progress towards degree and still graduate in 4 years.
Just for the audience, I think in fiscal year 11 we had about 90,000 dual credit students in the state, so that's a common occurrence.
Well, based on Joe's comment, my question would be, should we devise or modify our financial aid program to incentivize students to graduate as quickly as possible. If you arrive on the Texas A&M campus with 36 hours of dual credit courses, should we incentivize you to graduate in 3 years?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question and one that's not necessarily easy to answer, because some courses are structured in a way that you need to take them in a sequence, and whether or not that sequence of courses can be sped up for an individual student, that's not my expertise, but I know that there will be challenges for individual students to be able to do that. Will some students be able to graduate in 3 years? Absolutely, and we see some students do that.
So I'm not stopping the conversation on this first one, because ultimately it's tied into the second section, which is the end of eligibility for Texas Grant. So don't abandon ship on what's full time, because I think we'll continue to come back to that throughout the rest of the morning and the rest of the coming months probably. There have been a number of proposals that have been put forward as far as limiting eligibility. Currently the statute is 5 years for a 5-year program. 5 years for a 4-year program. Is it 6 years for a 5-year program? There have been ideas kicked around about limiting it to 120 semester credit hours of post-secondary education, or perhaps the 4th anniversary of your initial Texas grant, or perhaps after 8 full-time full semesters. It kind of fits back into the same conversation we're having about, are students progressing and are they making adequate progress towards their degree? And at what point should the state either influence them to hurry up and finish their degree, or facilitate them to finish their degree in a more leisurely pace, which is the current program facilitates that to happen. So I'm going to throw that one out there, and hopefully somebody will jump in other than myself.
Okay, I'll jump in. I do think we need to have some kind of limit. I think 150 hours is beyond. If we're talking about a limited amount of money that we have available, stretching the dollars, trying to incentivize students to graduate on time, 150 hours is too high. And the other thing that's been part of that calculation is hours where they didn't receive Texas Grant doesn't count against them. So if we're going to have 150 hours out there and they decide to go during the summer but they don't get Texas Grant, those hours don't count against the calculation for whether they're still eligible for Texas Grant. That's a flaw, in my opinion, because we have all these limits for federal aid eligibility and they can't exceed 150% and all that good stuff. So why would we not use the hours that they're taking to count against their eligibility for a limited grant program? So I'm a proponent of setting some kind of limitation, and if the data suggests that they don't need any extra incentive, to be incentivized once they get to the junior and senior level, they're going to finish, I would think that most of us could come up with some kind of resources to help them get that last semester out of the way, things like that. So there has to be a limit, whether it's 120 hours or 8 semesters. That to me would be better than having some kind of limit of I'm never going to be about the 15 hours a semester, because there's too many students that have fluctuating semesters like Joe was talking about. They come in with dual credit. If you have that dual credit coming in and they receive the Texas Grant for being full-time, they're going to graduate on time. So you set that limit and say, this is it. You have 120 hours. That's it.
You like to cap on semesters rather than a
cap every year?
Yeah, cap on, yeah, okay.
Yeah, just because students, in watching my students and the things that they go through, and some of them work more than others because of the population that I serve, and I know others serve the same kind of population, I think their hours may fluctuate. To dictate 15 hours a semester or even 30 hours a year may be a bit limiting, but if we limit it to full-time students, but they still have to progress, then they may have some semesters where they will be able to take more, or they have a couple of summers where they can finish, where they can take some extra hours, a couple of summers, but not every single summer. So that they can't always afford to go during the summer. That's the other issue that we have as well.
So it would be sufficient to require full-time enrollment and put some kind of a cap on the back end and really don't put any other limitations in between? Is that a fair, I mean, that's as broad to get to where you're going.
Yes.
Does it accomplish the same? Maybe.
What about 8 semesters for 120-hour degree program and 9 or 10 semesters for a program that requires more hours? That's simple and
It's easy to understand. When
Yes.
you're trying to explain to students, you've got 8 semesters of eligibility for a 4-year program.
Elaine Rivera, UTPA. I guess my only concern would be with the 8 semesters is whether summer would be included in that or not. It's not really, I mean, I would say then 8 regular semesters, academic year semesters, not summer semesters. The other thing, I guess, and I guess this would probably take care of it if we looked at it like that, but I have concerns about dual credit. Students are coming in with a lot of dual credit. A lot of times, those courses that they're bringing in don't really help them to get their degree. They're young, they're in high school, they may have taken something that, or a lot of courses that maybe in the end aren't helping them, but I don't want that to be held against them once they're on the college campus.
thank you. But we will certainly take that into account, yeah.
From that point, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why looking at it, if you're going to do some sort of cap, looking at it you have 8 semesters of eligibility is a whole lot cleaner and easier than 120 hours as the cap, knowing that they might have come in with 60 hours, but only 30 of them were usable in their degree program. We don't want to hurt that student because of some advising they got in high school and doing some things that were good choices perhaps for their own development in order to be competitive to go to college and those types of things, but may not have benefited them in terms of being pursuing the degree that they ultimately needed.
Well, we certainly don't want to hurt students. On the other hand, we don't want students to think, well, I've accumulated 36 hours, 40 hours of applicable credit towards a degree, so that means I'll have to take 9 hours a semester. And
right. No,
we don't want that either. So we have to find a proper balance between the two. But these are certainly legitimate concerns.
And I think the 8 semesters is 8 semesters of Texas grant eligibility,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's what we're talking about. So if they go during the summer, they're not going to get Texas grant during the summer. That semester's not going to count against them. That's what we're referring to, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think the 8 semesters is very logical. I'm a little bit worried about if there are no warnings along the way, you're going to end. I mean, I don't know how many students graduate in 4 years, but nationally, not that many, right?
phase this in. We would implement it.
I know, phasing in, but even so, there are going to, I mean, we're all multiplying and thinking if you know you only have the money for 4 years, then you're going to have to try to take a quarter of it approximately every year. And a lot of students aren't going to do that. And the question of, it would be great if you could solve that through advising and so on, but there really has to be, because you're going to end up with all these people. I mean, it's one thing to say if they get a little bit less grant money, they're not going to drop out, but to say you're done, you don't have a grant, and you still have a year left, I think you could risk losing those students. So you just need to figure out a way to be careful about what would happen to those students.
Yes, Jane, real quickly before we move on to the next one.
I'm Jane Caldwell with the coordinating board. If we went with the 8-semester approach, would there also be a time limit for completing those 8 semesters? How long would we track students to determine whether they're still eligible and so forth?
That's a good question. I think we'd have to deal with it. We'll ask for recommendations from people on the campuses. I think you'd probably have to set a reasonable ceiling. I don't know if it's 8 semesters within 6 or 5 years or 6 years. We typically, for some reason, we think that 6 years is a reasonable amount of time to be patient for students to graduate. So maybe we would do 8 semesters within a period of 6 years. But we'll certainly thank you for calling that issue to our attention.
Just real quickly, the folks listening online have been very aggressive with sending in questions, and I've gotten so many of them, and I haven't had a chance to read them all. So if we don't respond to your question, we will respond to it after the meeting is over, and hopefully make that available, or we will make that available to everybody that's here. I haven't had a chance to read them all. They're coming in so quickly. A lot of them, I think, will be answered as we continue the discussion. A lot of it is the same kind of comments that the folks up here have been commenting on. And if we miss something, we'll come back to you. Okay. So we're going to go to page 2, which is section 3, which again is tied into kind of the conversation we've continued to have, and that's with regard to academic progress requirements for receiving an award in a following year. So it's the current statute is very prescriptive of how many hours you have to complete, or what percentage of the courses that you enrolled for do you have to complete. Some of the discussion that we've just had might suggest that perhaps we don't have to be as narrow in continuing eligibility if we have a more tighter control on the front end with full-time enrollment, and then have a cap on the back end of a time certain amount of time that you have to continue to get a grant, and that the intermediate times become less important. That's Dan's interpretation of the conversation that we just had. Is that fair? Or do we need to continue with intermediate eligibility as is currently written? Did that make any sense at all? Yeah. Are we done with this section then?
Well, I mean, I would say that's a fair characterization. I mean, with regard to the change here, and I can imagine from a community college standpoint, one of the questions has got to be, are you talking about, when we're talking about Texas Grant Program, are we talking about the same for four-year universities and community colleges where there's a lot more part-time enrollment? So are we talking about the same standards of having to complete 30 hours in an academic year, or the same limitation of full-time enrollment, those kind of things, or are community colleges being treated differently in this process? I mean, I think that's got to be something that's looked at.
Well, of course, in the current program, community colleges are eligible, and they are held to the exact same standards that university students are held to. I think as we get further on into our section, some of the conversation will get more attuned to the community college students and availability of aid and structures of programs that make more sense for a community college student as opposed to this more full-time, time-to-degree oriented. Yes, thank you for coming up.
Laura Elizondo, Texas A&M International University. With what I heard, are we considering not having a maybe GPA requirement for progression from year to year?
I think when we drafted this, I think that we assumed that was not going to be put on the table for consideration, so that would continue to be requirement, at least a 2.5 GPA. The structure of this was only looking at this time essence and not necessarily what the GPA was. However,
is there an argument to be made to discard that criterion?
No, I think we do have to have some type of requirement from year to year. Students, if you don't put that bar for the students on what, that you do expect something on an annual basis, we may end up helping them for the 8 semesters or the 4 years, but they may not end up graduating.
Well, we hadn't thought about it, and obviously it would be inconsistent to the priority model if we didn't require continuing students to perform at adequate levels. So we hadn't thought about it, but we'll listen to any arguments that suggest we've overlooked something.
No, I mean, personally, I think we do need to keep the GPA requirement, and we do have to have some type of measure. If we're not looking at requiring 30 hours, 24 hours at the end of the academic year, or a certain percentage that must be passed at the end of each year, at least we need to have the GPA requirement.
Is it sufficient to make that a satisfactory academic progress by institution as being more transparent and easily understandable to students, or is this 2.5 or even a 2.75 or fill in the blank GPA I guess it's been 2.5 for years, right, Jane? There's always been pushback of why shouldn't it be satisfactory academic progress. The coordinating board, I think, has been pretty consistent that it needs to be 2.5. And I think that based on nodding of heads in the audience, it sounds like 2.5 is a minimum requirement. Perhaps, no, maybe.
I mean, that's what has always been, and I think that that works. We do have to explain to our freshmen that at the end of the first year is the school institution, SAP, and then they have to move to this. But most of our SAPs require a 2.0 or something different than a 2.5. And I think it has helped that, it's their first year of transition. So if you have something standard, it helps them to understand. But we tell them from up front, your goal should be the 24, the 2.5 from the very beginning, because that is what you have to maintain to continue in the program. So I think 2.5 will be fine, or even if we want to consider increasing. I mean, most of our programs require higher depending on where it is, but 2.5 seems to be the average academic set for most students.
Selma De Leon with the University of North Texas. I would say 2.5 is sufficient, not increase it or lower it.
I'm assuming that's the way you feel as well, Lisa, since you were shaking your head.
Yeah.
Okay.
I used to be a proponent of why don't we just have the same satisfactory academic progress standards that we do for all the other programs, but if we're moving this program to something with the priority model, the academically prepared students, I think there should be a little bit higher expectation than the standard Pell Grant student loan eligibility. So the 2.5 is like a compromise between scholarship, which is more like a 3.0, and satisfactory academic progress from a federal aid perspective. So it seems like a good compromise.
Thank you very much for your comment.
I would add on what you suggested here with the potential change. I think if you do the other where you're talking about increasing the full-time eligibility, if you're talking about 8-semester limits, if you're talking about having made progress towards degree, having 30 hours after year 1, 60 hours after year 2, then these changes are unnecessary.
So just leave them as they are.
Yeah, and if we're looking at, if we're going to set the 8-semester limit, I would agree with Joe, then why do you need the 30 hours? They do need to complete 24 semester hours because they're full-time. They can't get the grant unless they're full-time.
That makes sense.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and then the 75% has been in there because actually that's missing from, because they do still have to complete 75%. Along with the 24 hours and then the 2.5. So why would we need to change that if we're going to set that limit and say you have to progress, and this is a way that you can progress? Yeah.
Any other comments about Section 3? We're doing good on time, I think. Okay. I'll have to. Lynn, can I beg your indulgence to screen some of those online questions to see if perhaps we can answer some of them without. I'm not a very good multimodal person, so if you could help me with that, I would really appreciate it. I do know that one of the questions, and it's kind of germane to this progression and renewal rates, the historical averages for Texas Grant for university students from first year to second year is 71%. So of the 100% of students that got Texas Grant as freshmen, 71% would get a renewal award as a second year student. Of those, 63% get a third award. So that's essentially the inclusion of that 2.5 GPA. It's more rigorous to get a third award than it is to get a second award. And then kind of back to kind of Lee's points, 84% of those students make an eligibility to get a fourth award. So once you get to your third year, the likelihood of you getting a fourth award is very, very high, which is consistent. For community colleges, it's about 43% of first-time recipients get a second award, and then it drops off pretty substantially after that, primarily because it's more difficult in the third award year to meet the satisfactory academic requirements and GPA requirements. 71, first to second, 63 from second to third, 84 from third to fourth. Lynn, have you had any success reading any of my those great emails coming in from all over the country?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So the easy, now that we're done with the easy part, now we get to talk about the more difficult parts, which is more financial oriented than eligibility oriented. Section 4 is the notion of Texas grants after tuition and fees are paid. So these are grant aid in excess of tuition and fees. There's been discussion about limiting the amount of Texas grant to cover only tuition and fees. So your Pell Grant plus EFC plus Texas grant would be no more than tuition and fees. And books, I'm sorry. And books. So it's linking the Pell Grant Award with the Texas Grant Award and making these assurances to at least cover tuition and fees or the average tuition and fees. And I know that there's probably lots of questions with regard to this particular notion. And maybe, I don't know, Sandy, do you want to make any kind of comment on this or not really?
Well, no. Again, as rationing mechanisms go, this is not an unreasonable rationing mechanism. It's hard to be enthusiastic about it because for many students, the problem is not paying tuition because they do get grant aid that covers their tuition. And the problem is how are they going to live if they can't work full-time? And if they work full-time, how are they going to be successful in school? So I think I wouldn't say, how could you consider this? I mean, what you're saying is you have to put a limit on it and you need to give less money to individual students in order to spread the money around, and that's compelling. But I think that it's easy to just say, oh, why should we pay for living costs, when if you look at the problems that these students face, particularly if you look at community college students, where it's just really not, the tuition is just not the issue, you have to grapple with that problem.
Could I ask the institutions that are here? I guess we struggle with the interactions of set-aside grant aid and institutional grant aid relative to, federal state aid. We make certain assumptions about TPEG recipients and HB 3015 recipients, and we somewhat tend to isolate those off into separate compartments. Are those the grant aid that goes to pay for living expenses? Or is that a complete erroneous thought?
Elaine Rivera, UTPA. We use a lot of our TPEG funds to assist the students that are not receiving Texas grants. So it's really paying tuition and fees helping to pay tuition and fees generally for those students. The only other thing they're probably getting is a Pell Grant. And depending on the size of the Pell Grant, it could cover both things, or tuition, fees, and books, but it might not. I do have a little bit of a concern with limiting the Texas grant amount based on tuition, fees, and books, and including EFC and Pell Grant. Because I think what happens is you're kind of pulling out the support from the students that need it the most. In a lot of cases, the very needy students, the ones that qualify for the maximum Pell Grant, at our institution, they probably then wouldn't qualify for very much Texas grant. And yet they need those funds for living expenses as well. And so I am very concerned about having the effect of kind of pulling the rug out from them and then just making it financially impossible for them to go to school.
I guess, Elaine, within the context of, and again, we're looking at 2014 and beyond, maybe 2016 and beyond, in a world where your freshman class, potentially, imagine this, if your freshman class were fully Texas grant recipients. So you don't have half of your entering class not getting a grant and then progressing through your pipeline never getting a Texas grant. So creating the eligibility for a incoming student such that more state aid gets redistributed in a different manner. I guess I'm guilty of this. I have so many preconceived notions about how the current program works that when we have conversations like this, you have to divorce yourself from the notion of a junior that didn't get a Texas grant as a freshman, because fundamentally we're talking about trying to eliminate that situation. Am I way off base on that, or?
Well, I think the thing is we're in an environment of limited funds, and so as we spread funds around, it's also going to mean that that grant amount is probably going to go down. It's not going to be the maximum that it is now. We are also facing potential cuts in the Pell Grant program. So we don't know if that floor is going to be there for the very neediest students, or it remains constant at the value that it is now, so that it loses its buying power as we go through time. So again, I think that I do have a concern with capping the Texas grant program, particularly taking into account the Pell Grant, because the Pell Grant is kind of that basic, floor that's providing assistance for the very neediest students, and it's kind of like you're penalizing them because they have a Pell Grant. You're going to then limit the amount of Texas grant that they can receive.
Related to that, it is true that, there are some states where if you get a higher Pell Grant, your state grant goes down dollar for dollar because they're trying to give you a certain amount of money, and that's obviously problematic because it does away with the progressivity of the Pell Grant. So it depends on how high tuition is and whether this is going to be operative or not. But one thing that you want to be careful about is tuition sensitivity. You wouldn't want institutions to be raising their tuition in order for their students to be eligible for the maximum grant. And it doesn't sound like tuition sensitivity, but actually it could be, right? And so I would be careful about that.
Well, that was one of the points I was going to make. I think you got to be real careful with this on a variety of levels. I think in one sense it is a way to limit how much money you're actually spending. In another way, though, how this plays out on individual campuses is very, very different. If your tuition and fees is low, then they're getting far less money from this program, and in some respects one would argue need less money from the program under this type of rule. On the flip side, this same type of scenario, if you have a high tuition and fee campus, their need for this money is much greater. So how you handle that in the allocation methodology, how do you handle making sure that you're simply not shifting money to institutions that charge more than other institutions? There's a lot of questions in this that will play into things like allocation methodology, who's eligible, how do you do allocation methodology when this is specific to a campus based on tuition and fees, or is this based on a statewide average of tuition and fees, which is a very different type thing, which is what the current methodology is for setting the maximum amount. So I think there's a lot of, the idea is one that I think needs a lot of additional thoughts behind. How do you handle all those different aspects of how this would impact?
I think the original thought was that it would be tied to average tuition and fees and not a particular campus tuition and fees.
So it would be tied to the 7,400?
If it were in place next year, it would be tied to 7,400.
And I think,
Plus books.
Plus books, yes. And how do we determine what the amount is for books?
Jane will determine.
I don't really understand completely, because I did something kind of like that this year when we were given the flexibility. The EFC thing I don't necessarily agree with, adding that into the calculation. I took our average tuition and fees, and then I basically, it was tuition and fees minus Pell equals Texas grant, because that's how I was able to distribute the money. My average award came out to about a little over $4,000 because I spread it out, but I was able to give it to a lot more new students. And then I had some supplemental funding for students living on or off campus that I begged for and utilized that to help cover those costs, because we do have a lot of students that are living either in apartments or on campus. They wouldn't be able to afford it as a freshman, even if they borrowed the maximum Stafford loan eligibility. So that's what we tried to use as a guide for those additional funds.
Would you send us information about this methodology? We'd like to take a look at it.
Sure, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. But my concern is, I have the same concern that everybody else is talking about. If you do use the average tuition and fees, which it's $7,400, I just don't know that I agree with the EFC being added into that calculation. And there's a couple of reasons, because it's worked really well for us to just say tuition and fees minus Pell equals Texas grant. That took care of being equitable and fair to every single student. But my concern with that EFC being added in there, you have a lot of students that are on the cusp. They're getting, $600 in Pell. And they have a higher EFC, it's not going to come out to taking care of those students that are they're still poor. They still have issues with paying for tuition and fees. So adding that EFC into that 7,400 minus Pell minus EFC equals the Texas grant would concern me, because I think we need to bring those students up to some of the same level as the kids getting 55-50 in Pell. So I would have a big concern with adding that EFC. If we're going to do that kind of calculation, adding in that EFC would be a big concern for some of my kids that are, they still have low incomes, they're still struggling to pay for school. We would have to give them some supplemental funding, because that EFC 4,000 EFC added into that calculation would take away a big chunk of their Texas grant.
So when does EFC become germane in your calculations? Because ultimately it's not, the methodology that you use says it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant up until average tuition and fees, because you're not considering it in your packaging, because it's Pell plus Texas grant. Not
in my Texas grant packaging. I'm not considering EFC. EFC is going to be used for any other need-based aid that they might be eligible for. And, so we have to use EFC for that type of calculation. I don't think it should be used to determine that Texas grant amount if we're using an average tuition and fees, because knowing the population, a 0 EFC kid is not that much different than a 4,000 EFC kid. It really isn't, realistically speaking. So I would have issues with not being able to give a 4,000 EFC student the same amount of Texas grant as or a combination of Texas grant plus Pell.
We'll have to arm wrestle on that one, because there's distinctions made at the Capitol between a 3850 EFC and a 3900 EFC, that the 3850 student is much more needy than a 3900 student, because there's a $50 difference between the two. So those are, unfortunately, EFC has a dollar amount attached to it, so people assume that there's money.
But there really isn't.
Well, I understand.
That realistically speaking.
Sure. But I think that's something that we're going to have to wrestle with over the next couple of months.
I think there's also, so if this methodology was in place for this year, your average, and assuming $1,000 for books, your average Texas grant award would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,500 to $2,600. That's even half of what you're talking about, what you've recommended us to do at a $5,000 average award. And at some point you get to, I understand and appreciate the goal of trying to cover at least 50% of incoming freshmen, but at some point you reach a dollar amount in the grant amount that loses its effectiveness.
Well, and that's what we have to make sure we know what that threshold is.
Right.
And we have to work together to figure out what makes sense. Once again, I remind you that if you look at the pattern of higher education enrollments, where about 2/3 of entering higher education students in Texas are starting off at community colleges, and the bulk of those want to transfer to universities, we've got to create a pathway for those students to get financial aid when they transfer. So we've got to take those students into account.
We're still doing our eye on time. Lynn, or we have any specific questions that we can address, or?
Well, as I said, the majority.
Okay. One is in comment to the recent changes to satisfactory academic progress at the federal level, where many institutions are now going to monitoring SAP on a semesterly basis to meet those new regulations. This particular institution is wanting to know, is there any consideration of changing the requirement to check GPA SAP for Texas grant on a semesterly basis as opposed to an annual basis because of the federal changes?
But not all of us are checking SAP on every single student every semester. So we have to be careful. I mean, that's one thing to take into consideration on that. I'm still doing it annually.
There's some concern from some of the institutions that are sending in comments that there's questions from the two-year schools that it sounds like perhaps the proposals that are being made are moving Texas grant away from the two-year schools and focusing on the four-year institutions.
Well, I'll address that. There's the nature of community college students. We grapple with this frequently within our staff discussions about crafting programs that make sense for the different student populations. Texas grant in its current form probably doesn't make a lot of sense for a community college student, but it's the only way for them to keep a Texas grant as a university student. There's likelihood that it's better to have a more robust TEOG program for community college students, provided there's a pathway for that student to get a Texas grant as a four-year student. So the answer to the question is yes, with the caveat that there's going to have to be kind of the tit-for-tat, give and take with community college students relative to what the program is called, not necessarily whether the funds would be there for those particular students. Good question, though.
Well, let me respond. We're very much aware that community college students are typically the poorest of all the students that are enrolled in higher education. We want to make sure that we fund those students at appropriate levels given our resources. And we also know that the bulk of community college students do indicate that their ultimate goal is to achieve a baccalaureate degree. So we want to find ways to help those students transfer and either secure new levels of financial aid, because obviously it's much more expensive to attend a university than community college. So it's not a matter of focusing on universities as opposed to community colleges. It's a matter of using our resources effectively in all our institutions of higher education to help students achieve their academic goals.
Embedded in Section 5 is a little bit of a Band-Aid, if for lack of a better word, of looking at some kind of structure within the statute that allows for lower award amounts to be made as opposed to the full tuition and fee average. There is a Texas Grant Oversight Committee within the statute. This is a notion that the commissioner would have to go before the Texas Grant Oversight Committee in order to make, based on available funding, how much money would be available either on an award basis, on a campus basis. I just wanted to bring that up because it's in there, but it's not evident as it's tied with that what the current statute calls for. So I'm just merely pointing that out. Section 6 is the use of matching funds to make up the difference between the average Texas grant award and what the actual tuition and fees are. Essentially, the discussion have been to eliminate that section within the statute, essentially not requiring institutions to make up the difference between whatever the Texas grant award amount is and the actual tuition and fees at that particular campus. Please. This is great timing.
Oh, God, sorry. Donna Howard, State Representative. I really was here to listen. I didn't particularly want to comment or say anything, but thought I'd just ask one question because if you said it, I missed it, which has to do with any information about the amount of award that's required to get the students to enroll in the first place. I'm hearing you talk about persistence and the different things that occur from year to year that impact, that are correlated to
Kind of a magical
to the award.
question.
Yeah. It's magical?
That's a magical question because, of course, we'd love to know what the answer to that is. Lee, can you respond to that?
Well, microphone.
There's a. I think that we have the data to support that kind of analysis. It would be a different data set than what we've got for the Rider 60. But I think that's a very compelling question. I mean, there's an extensive literature on there. I mean, the literature basically says, more money matters, right? And so, in order to translate that into the Texas context, to get these sort of sensitivity points and trying to look at, how the shape of a curve might inform policy, it would require another full-blown type of analysis using the Texas data in that context.
Well, it seems to me that with all the discussion that we're having here around a limited pot of money and how to best utilize that's certainly an important question in how we're going to be making these determinations. But it may be that, like you say, we have to have some other data in place first, and that means that question can't be answered for a while. I don't know, but it's certainly something I would be asking and be concerned about.
Can we answer that question, Dan and Lee?
We certainly have the data to address that question. It would take some tooling up to do that, but yes, indeed, we've got the analysis, we've got the information.
Well,
and I think there's a lot of anecdotal data that would give ranges of values, and I think that it varies by institution, of course, so that whenever you put it into an average context, looking out on a state, you get kind of mushy. But we tried to look at kind of de minimis award amounts. At what point does the award amount get too small that it doesn't influence behavior? But the level of detail that you're asking about will take some additional study, but we can do that.
We'll do it.
Okay, thank you. And I also liked the suggestion of inverting what you were looking at. That certainly would give you another perspective on this in terms of what the appropriate amount is that gets behavior going either direction there. But and I know y'all aren't here to talk about politics, and I really don't want to get into all that either, but certainly all of the stuff that you're talking about, having been involved with this for the past couple of sessions, that I don't know what the questions are, but the political questions certainly need to be a part of the context within which you're making these decisions, because it doesn't matter to some degree how rational the approach is if indeed those elements aren't factored into how this proceeds. And first come, first served, I think a lot of us have been talking about for a couple of sessions now, has not been the best way to do this program. And yet, because of some concerns people have, whether they're based on facts or not, that it impacts certain groups of students in our state are resistant to making any change if they think, rightly or wrongly, that it will impact certain. I'm being so obtuse here, but you know what I'm talking about, basically. So I'm just concerned about that as we move forward as well. And the other major part of the pushback politically from certain parts of the legislature have to do with the fact that if we allow a new process to move forward based on a smaller pot of money and anticipating that pot of money may get even smaller, especially if our population increases, which is, again, a competing thing happening here. We want to grow the population, but we're not growing the pot of money with it. But the concern among some is that if we move forward with these new ways of doing things, that just solidifies putting less money into the program and is counterintuitive to those of us who want more money to be available. And so those are just factors, for whatever they're worth, that I think need to be talked about in some way by you guys as you're preparing to move forward with your recommendations. Thank you.
Can I circle back real quick?
Yes.
Thinking about the question about how to look at enrollment in the first place a little bit more. One of the things that would be very helpful in looking at students' decisions on whether or not to enroll is the amount of financial aid offered. Right? So if a student graduates from high school, they apply to a school and they get accepted and they get an offer of financial aid. Right? Their decision to enroll is in part determined by that financial aid offer.
Right.
Whether or not they go to that institution or another institution, another four-year institution, or whether or not they decided to go to a community college instead is in part driven by the affordability issue. Right.
Right.
So, and that information offered is not, we don't have that right now. And so what I would really like to do is try to work with maybe a group of institutions willing to help us out in getting those data so we can run those analysis matching, of high school graduates, what the relationship is between financial aid package offered and their actual decisions to enroll in the first place. That would be very helpful.
Representative Howard, I can tell you that we're very sensitive to the political issues that you discussed, and we will confer with members and their staffs about these issues every step of the way. I can't speak for the board because we haven't brought these issues to the attention of the board because we're still so much in the formative stages of developing recommendations. But I can't foresee that the board will not continue to regard funding state financial aid as its highest priority in its funding requests. And we're very much aware of the concern that you just expressed, and we will deal with that. But we also have to recognize that a diminishment of financial aid is a possibility. And once you've established that precedent, it can certainly happen again. We're looking at ways to make the best use of whatever money we have available.
And I think that's the responsible thing to do, and I appreciate what you're trying to do, for sure. I think it's the right thing to do.
And knowing your interest in these issues, we will certainly confer with you directly.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We're fast approaching the witching hour. I want to give Sandy one more opportunity to kind of maybe close out our conversation. And of course, we'll give the commissioner the last word.
Thank you. I am very happy to be part of this conversation. I'm very impressed with the conversation, the dialogue among the different constituents, and the way all of you are thinking about this, I think, is unusual. So I think it's great. And I guess I would just say that, there are a lot of hard questions. And one thing is that, as is going on here, it's really important to take some things, and they might sound good at first, but you want to think really hard about what might the unintended consequences be and make sure that you look at the issues from all sides. And focusing on both access and success is just terrifically important because we want to get people into college. But there are some changes that might, be viewed as discouraging people, but that actually would help people to get through better, that would be good changes. And I think some of the things you're talking about are necessary because you need to ration and you're not rationing in the best way now. And then other things, like you've talked about the 2.5 GPA, everyone seems to feel like that's a good thing to have, not because it will save money, but because it's better for students to have that incentive for progression and not to throw money after people who aren't progressing. But keeping some sort of perspective on what are things that you wish you could do, but you're willing to give them up because if you have to give up something, and what are things that will just strengthen the program regardless of how well funded it is. So something like the part-time student question, I'm sure there are differences of opinion, but it may be that it would be great to fund part-time students, but if you have to choose, you won't fund part-time students. And you want to be careful about saying, we're not funding them because they're never going to graduate. What's the point of funding them? And you want to say, if we have to choose, we'll choose that. That's different from putting in criteria that will make the program more effective. And I think the way you're doing this is right, because you have to think hard about all the implications of these things.
Commissioner, before I let you have the last word, just organizationally, we have a financial aid advisory committee that meets mostly quarterly, and our next official meeting is June 14th. We'll continue to have conversations over the next few weeks, but there's an official meeting that's already on the calendar on June 14th. So our visitors that are watching online, the people that are here, you might put that on your calendars as something firm that's going to happen in the not too distant future. But we are going to continue to work on this and continue the dialogue, and then I'll turn it over to the Commissioner.
I'll just say very briefly, this is the beginning of a conversation, and we wanted more than anything else at this meeting to give you a sense of the complexity of the issues, of the trade-offs that we're going to have to consider making. We want to make sure that we take advantage of the expertise that exists on the campuses in making these changes, and I just want to be ready for whatever changes occur, either demographically or politically, and have a program, a series of recommendations that would help us address the challenges as they change and as, once again, the needs and the political environment in the state changes. So we will continue to be in touch. To the people that are listening in, we welcome your comments, and please don't find it necessary to wait until we have meetings to send us your good ideas. We try to lay out the general range of issues that we're taking a look at. If you have ideas about those, let us know right now. Meanwhile, we will run the data. We will take all of your questions and comments, all of the suggestions you have about how to run the data. We will do that, and hope that this is, once again, this is a beginning and a process of developing the best possible financial aid policy for the state. Thank you, and let's eat. Where's the food?
Where is the food? Food's in the back. Food's in